Greetings, viewers. Eric the Car Guy here, back again with another live show for you. It's been a while. I had to skip a couple weeks ago because I was out of town, but now we are back to answer your automotive questions here on this live show on Google+. A couple of things for starters. First, thank you for watching, and hey, how are you? Some people actually get mad when I don't say that, but I truly do care how you are. So if I don't say it, I'm still thinking it. Questions for this Google Plus event will be taken from the Google Plus event. They won't be taken from the YouTube comments, so if you're posting comments on YouTube, I cannot see those while they're there. I'm also going to stick to automotive questions. I noticed this time there were some other questions that weren't necessarily automotive related. I tried to keep this on the automotive side of things rather than, speculation and long protracted discussions about stuff that doesn't pertain to repair necessarily. Questions posted to the Google Plus event after the event has concluded will also not be answered. I know I'm telling you all these things that I'm not doing, but I will be answering the questions on the Google Plus page, and that's where I will be getting these from. I usually start posting about it about a week ahead in advance. But you can always get answers at EricTheCarGuy.com 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. There's a welcome video there to tell you about all the amazing features. I will also post links in the description to the things that are discussed here and some useful articles for you. So I will try to throw as much information as possible at you in the next half hour based on these questions that are posted, and also, as I said, down in the description, links to stuff that already exists in the Eric the Car Guy universe. So why don't we just get started? As I said, it is a half-hour show, and it goes quickly in my experience. And another thing, I apologize if I butcher your names in advance. Sometimes it happens. I don't mean it, but yeah, just thank you for your understanding on that. Okay, why don't we start with Damien Pagan. He was the first one to post a question. He has a 2001 Acura Integra automatic. When shifting gear back into park, it often stiffens, and I have to push harder to get it into park. All the other gears move easily. Only happens when going into park. Sometimes I have to slam it in position. Do you have any idea what might be going on? It's something I have run into a couple of times, but it's not something I run into often. One of the first things that I would do in that situation is I would raise the vehicle and I would remove the connection where the shift cable, which runs from the shifter in the console to the transmission, connects to the transmission. There's a little cover. You'll see a cable running from the console or the underside of the vehicle around the exhaust out to the transmission. So follow that cable to where it meets the transmission, disconnect it from the transmission, and then try to move your gear lever. And if your gear lever moves good then you know the problem is not with the shift cable or with the shifter itself. If you still have a problem and you're disconnected from the transmission, that means that there's an issue either in the cable itself or in the console. And for that, you can, well, actually it probably is in the console. It's hard to say, but either way, you're basically isolating the problem to being something internal to the transmission or something outside of the transmission, i.e. that console shifter or something like that. Now, maybe you have a problem with a shift lock. I don't see it often, and it should only really matter as far as getting it out of gear, not necessarily putting it into gear. So usually when there's a problem with a shift lock, it'll keep it in park, and you won't be able to get it out of park. So I'm not so sure you have an issue there, but that's the way I would proceed. And there's, as far as that connection to the transmission, if memory serves, there's a little tab bent over on top of a 10mm fastener after you move a cover, I think, in order to access that cable connection. Do that and just move it back and forth. Put the parking brake on so that, well, it shouldn't move because when you remove the cable from the transmission, it'll still be in park anyway. But if you have the front of the car lifted, you definitely want to have the rear wheels locked. And not a bad idea to stick something back there so it doesn't roll off the jack stands while you're working. But that's what I would do to try to isolate the problem. All right, let's see. Moving on here. As I said, there were other questions that were posted that weren't necessarily repair related, and I don't intend to cover those. So now this is an interesting one from Tony Marzarella. He has a 2002 Ford F-150 Triton V8. One day we were buffing it after having washed it for an hour earlier and began to try to start itself over and over. After the initial shock of thinking it was haunted, I removed the battery wire. Didn't wash under the hood. Have you ever heard of this? Any ideas? I don't believe that vehicle comes stock with a remote start. I'm suspecting that you had a remote start installed on the truck. Uh, I've run into lots of issues with these. Now, granted, many of the issues with remote starts that I've run into weren't necessarily the fault of the remote start. A lot of times it had to do with the installation. So if you have a remote start on that vehicle, that would be my prime suspect. If it's a factory installed remote start, I'm wondering if there's some kind of codes that you could pull for that could possibly indicate what the issue might be. Maybe there's a receiver error or something like that. It's receiving a signal to start when it shouldn't. Really difficult to say. But as far as you washing the vehicle, if that had anything to do with it, I don't think so. As you said, you didn't wash underneath the hood, so that shouldn't have anything to do with it. But maybe moving the truck around while you're buffing it, that type of thing, maybe that caused it to trigger. I'm not sure. But if it were me, I would be looking for a remote start problem if that was the case. And if you have an aftermarket remote starter installed, definitely check that installation, make sure it's correct, and then contact the company that sold you the starter or wherever you got it from, and perhaps they can help troubleshoot the problem for you. Okay, next we have Eric Zubia. He has a 1997 Civic HX VTEC E having a few different issues you may be able to help me with. While I'm at a dead stop, as soon as I accelerate, the car feels like it's a standard catching first gear, but the car is an automatic. As it does that, the brake light turns on, but the brake fluid is full. Also, the RPM goes up as I accelerate, but the car doesn't move very fast. Then on the highway, the car shakes at about 60 and will not accelerate anymore. I've replaced the timing belt, the motor mounts. Once these are fixed, the car works fine for a day or so and then goes back to how it was. I honestly have no idea what it could be other than the tranny. When I switch from park to drive, the motor moves up and down a bit. Then when I go to reverse, it moves the other direction. Any help would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for all that you do. God bless. Thank you. Okay, Eric. By the sound of it and reading through this, the fact that you were able to, let's say, reset the problem and it wasn't consistent, so I'm going to hazard a guess as to when you did that timing belt that you might have disconnected the battery during that job, which is something that is often recommended. And in doing so, if there's what I'm sensing here is perhaps an electronic problem, perhaps with a control unit or perhaps wiring. Not really sure. It's difficult to say, but I do agree with you in that it does seem to be transmission related. That transmission is electronically shifted. Therefore, if there's a problem with a control unit or something, the transmission may act up. So actually, one of the first places I would go is to check your battery, its connections, and your battery voltage. If your battery voltage is low, all the other electrical systems on the vehicle are affected by that low voltage, and they may tend to act up, such as what you experienced there. The brake light coming on in the dash, I'm going to ignore that, because if you turn off the key or you just turn the key to the on position and the engine is not running, that light comes on. So that's kind of normal. Or perhaps the fluid in the master cylinder is sloshing around enough to cause that light to come on. I don't think that light is part of your worries, but it's good to include that in the description. What I do believe is that you have some sort of electrical issue, and it could be either, as I stated, low voltage due to a battery that's weak or poor connections at that battery, causing the electrical systems of the vehicle not to have sufficient power to run properly. If that's the case, load test your battery or have your battery load tested to see if there's an issue there, and also disconnect the battery cables, clean them up, make sure they're secure on the battery when you replace them back on there, and see if the problem goes away. If the problem still remains at that point, I would suspect that you would have some sort of code stored in the system. Usually with Hondas, they'll flash a D4 light with the automatics or the S light, depending upon what it is. But right in the center of the dash, one of those drive lights will flash at you if it indicates a problem. So it's sort of like the transmission's version of the check engine light. I've done a video on how to pull codes on that 97. You don't necessarily need a scanner to pull the codes, but you just clip on a connector. I'll post the link in the description of that video so you can go to it quickly, but it's pulling codes without a scanner for Hondas if you want to look that up. and see if you have a code that's related to that transmission. If there is a code there, then I would pursue the troubleshooting for that code. And I would pay particular attention if, like, to the wiring, things like that. Maybe I've seen rodent infestations come about to where sometimes they chew through the insulation on wiring and cause issues, something like this, or there could be some other installation issues. You'll basically have to take that as it comes. But start at the battery, make sure the battery is good, make sure its connections are good. If they're all good and you still have an issue, then look for codes. If you've got codes, then follow the troubleshooting for those codes, and hopefully that will lead you to an answer to that problem. So good luck to you, Eric. All right, Benjamin Fischer has a kind of a long one here. 05 Buick Rendezvous, power windows, rear right, 12 volts and ground, home run from battery to regulator motor tabs. I'm guessing you're running your own power and ground to that regulator motor. One way the motor makes normal sounds, but that's up and the window's already up. It won't go down. But I switch wires and it sparks. Guessing bad motor. However, I also have a wiring issue if motor really is bad. Rear right taps from driver right, which also doesn't work to roll down right window. I pulled driver buttons out, disconnected connector from power windows, 4 sets of 2 wires, 3 of 4 sets continuity test passes, the other 2 fail, which go to the rear right. This would seem to be before the driver buttons, which seems to me to be the wires going out of the window master switch. Center block fuse 30 amp for all power windows, so it's after that, so fuse should be okay. Wiring diagram, I don't have time to look at the wiring diagram, I apologize for that, but that's what you're going to need. You're going to need the wiring diagram. Many systems like that run all the windows through the master power switch on the door. So you're kind of on the right track there. However, it's confusing that if you switch the wires on the motor, which the way those motors work is they work in different directions. It just changes the polarity whether the motor is going up or going down on a power window. So if you run the voltage through in one direction, that means the window moves up. If you switch the polarity and run everything in the opposite direction, the motor spins in the opposite direction and the window comes down. So I think you've already got that part figured out. Now what's interesting is when you switch the wires and you've got everything disconnected from the circuit, I'm assuming you've got everything disconnected from the circuit, and you get a spark and the window does not go down. If that's the case, then there's something going on with that window motor. Now, it may not be the motor. Perhaps the regulator's in a bind and not allowing the motor to move freely, and that could be the cause of the problem. So everything could be fine electrically, and it could, in essence, be a mechanical issue causing that problem. So the fact that you switched the wires and you saw a spark, that sort of says to me that there might be a lot of amps being drawn there, and if that's the case, then that may be because the motor is trying to work really hard to overcome something. So I would look to see if that window is binding first and foremost. As far as the specifics of everything else, I would leave your search to that window motor because, as you said, you're able to activate it when it's isolated from the system. So what I do in those situations, excuse me for a second, I'm talking too much. What I do in those situations is I isolate the circuit similar to what you did. I go straight to the window motor, disconnect it from the circuit, and I try exactly what you're trying with adding power and ground to that connector where the that goes to the window motor, and I try to work the window motor in both directions. If I'm unable to do it, then I know my problem is isolated there. I also check when I work the switch at the connector when it's disconnected to that window motor to see if it's getting the power and ground, the commands from the switches. So if you check in one direction of the switch, you should see power on one terminal or ground, depending upon which one you do. But then when you move the switch to the opposite direction, it should change from a power to a ground or a ground to power, depending upon how it's set up. As I said, that's what it does, is it basically changes the polarity of the voltage going to the window motor to make it go in one direction or the other. Now, so that's what I do. I check to see if the commands are there, and I check to see if the motor is capable. That's usually what I do with the situations of electrical. Now, if I'm not getting the power and ground signals to the connector, once again, disconnected, if I'm not getting the power and ground signals that I'm expecting to see there, then I break out the wiring diagram and start chasing down where those power and grounds are supposed to come from. But in your case, I would check to see if there's a mechanical issue first that's causing that motor not to move properly, because that may be the cause of everything. So don't rule out the easy stuff. Maybe that's wedged in there, maybe the regulator, maybe I believe those are cable operated. Maybe the cable came off or something and it's not allowing it to move freely. So look for a mechanical issue first and consult with that wiring diagram that you posted there. Now, I get asked this almost every time, and I'm just gonna throw this out. Here's a quick answer to this question. Ben DeCourt asks, what would you recommend as a first car, as I have just passed my test and I'm looking for a good runner as a first car? Congratulations on passing your test, and welcome to the world of motoring. That being said, as I stated, I get asked this question a lot. You know, what car should I buy? What car should I buy? What car should I buy? I don't give an answer to this other than make sure whatever you do buy is checked over by a professional mechanic, or that you take the time yourself to thoroughly look the vehicle over. Now, the best case scenario is having it looked over by somebody who's familiar with that brand, make, and model. General repair shops, yeah, or general repair shops. I just did a video earlier this week on ETCG 1 talking about you tend to specialize. And one of the things that you have, or an advantage that you have if you work on a specific car line, is you have sort of that back knowledge of all the different models. So you know what the pattern failures might be. You know what those technical service bulletins might be. You'll be aware of those potential failures down the road. So if you're doing a used car inspection and you're an expert on that particular make, model, or vehicle line or whatever, you're more apt to catch the little things that somebody as a quote-unquote general practitioner may not catch. Now, there are great general practitioners out there that can do wonderful inspections and just know what they're doing. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that you can't take it to somebody, but take it to a trusted mechanic, whatever, or thoroughly look it over yourself if you feel so inclined. But anytime you're looking for a used car, don't care what brand it is, whatever, I'm not going to sit here and say, buy this car and look for this car. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say whatever you decide on, have it looked over and assess its mechanical condition before you purchase it. Can't tell you how many people I've disappointed after they've just purchased the car and they bring it to me and I say it needs major repairs. I hate delivering that type of news. So that's the reason why I'm answering that question, but I'm going to move on from there. All right, let's see. Well, here's an interesting one. Donovan Hules? Sorry. Electrical grounding. I just got an 07 Mazda 3, and there is much talk about getting a grounding kit. Why would one need one for the whole engine compartment? They do make one specifically for grounding the throttle body. Apparently, there's some interference with the MAF sensor that causes delayed throttle response. I guess I'm wondering, does this all sound like BS? Great question. For the most part, it's pretty wires under your hood. The manufacturer, especially with modern vehicles, with all the electronics that they use, they rely heavily on electronics. So they spend a lot of time trying to make sure that their electrical system is sound. So in other words, the stock system should work just fine. However, if there's a vehicle with known issues, such as what you're mentioning about the throttle body, that type of thing, if you are having a delayed response from the throttle, it's something to try. It's an easy thing to try. Whether or not it's going to have an effect, I don't know. Just to be perfectly honest, I don't know. But as far as grounding kits in general, I think it's a way to sell you more stuff. Because as I said, it's not like the people that engineered the vehicle engineered it not to work properly. They want it to at least get out of the warranty period. How's that? But in my experience, especially if you're in a rust belt kind of area, Mazdas tend to rust up pretty good after a while, and rust can cause issues with the ground connections. Maybe that's what they're speaking to. Not real sure on that, but because I don't know specifically on Mazdas. But to answer your question, if you think you need it, buy it. If you don't, well, save your money. There might be something else there. And here's another just quick, interesting question from Ken Izell. Question for your YouTube Live. Does refrigerant in a closed system with no leaks lose its effectiveness over time? That's a great question. No, it does not. The chemical makeup of the refrigerant should remain constant. So it's not like, say, a power steering fluid or the oil in your engine or your transmission fluid or something like that, where it's a good idea to change it out every so often. The actual refrigerant itself doesn't really go bad. It's just 134A is just a chemical compound that is what it is, that goes through the system, the AC system, and performs its function. So to answer your question, no, it's not really like that. However, what does happen is it leaks out. What compromises performance in AC systems for the most part is the refrigerant eventually leaks out, and enough of it can leak out to hamper performance over time. So you get to that point where your performance isn't necessarily as good, and so at that point you would either top off the system. I do this often, and when I do, I add a little bit of dye to the system, so therefore I know where those leaks are should they show up again. And many times, just as an FYI, find a lot of leaks at the actual Schrader valves, the service ports themselves, where you put the refrigerant into the vehicle. Also, I'm going to say that I don't consider AC work something that's really for the average DIY. It involves a lot of experience and special tools and things that they don't necessarily possess. And I've done my best to try to make videos on the topic to make it as approachable as possible for those that wish to venture into that realm. But I know experienced technicians that still have issues doing AC work. And you as a DIY, you may care about your vehicle a little bit more, but at the same time, if you don't have that back knowledge, that may cost you. And what I mean when I say that is if you overcharge it, or if you hook something up incorrectly, or you vent the refrigerant in the atmosphere, there's a lot of laws and regulations regarding that type of thing, and you may be breaking the law by doing so. In fact, you may not even by law be able to service your own AC system. I know that sucks, especially me, preaching all this DIY stuff. However, AC is one of those areas where I'm always hesitant to give a bunch of advice. But to answer your question, no, it does not degrade over time. It leaks out a little bit, and that's what causes your performance to go down. And the other thing is moisture. When moisture gets in the system, it can also be an issue. So they have actually items within the AC system, either a receiver dryer or what's the other one called? Can't think of it right now off the top of my head, but they're designed, there's a desiccant designed to keep moisture out of the system. So moisture getting in, refrigerant leaking out, those two things hamper performance over time. Okay. All right, here's another one that I may know something about. Michael Zargonzola. Hey, Eric, you've been a great help for me as a fellow DIYer. As you may remember, I've been repairing my 1996 Acura Integra 1.8 dual overhead cam non-VTEC. I have a P1336 code. The engine light will never clear with the scanner or disconnecting the battery. I've replaced the crankshaft sensor and the engine light went off finally, however it came back on when driving. I've read that the distributor can be internally bad. Any suggestions? Thanks as always. Well, and this is why I'm answering this question, because I do know a thing or two about this code. Now, I can't remember whether the 96 model year actually used a separate crank sensor. It sounds like it did because you say you've replaced it. That crank sensor actually fastens right behind the timing cover on the front of the engine. What often happens with those, and what will often cause this code, is if somebody does that timing belt and does not take the wire loom for that sensor and attach it to the timing cover again, what will happen is that wire will be loose and rub against the alternator belt as the engine runs. In doing so, it rubs right through the wiring and basically kills that sensor signal. Therefore, you get that code. So you can replace the sensor all day long, but really the problem is about 6 inches this way, where it's rubbed through the timing belt, or where it's rubbed through because of the alternator belt contact. Now, I often say this, and I say it a lot. Aftermarket distributors for Hondas, I have seen many problems with. It seems like, I don't know what it is, but Hondas just do not seem to like aftermarket distributors. And I will go on record as saying that. In my experience, I've had nothing but issues with aftermarket distributors for Hondas. If you have an aftermarket distributor on that video and you can't get rid of that, or if you have an aftermarket distributor on that engine, you I would say seek out an original equipment distributor. I would rather take a used one out of a salvage yard than a new aftermarket distributor. In fact, I did a video on it, and that's exactly what I did. I found a distributor in the back, put it on that car, and as far as I know, it's still running to this day. And I did that years ago, but I also sold the car a couple of years ago, so I really honestly don't know. But from everything I knew, that made it go away. I'm going to jump up to the top to maybe somebody who's recently posted a question, because we're running out of time here. Oh, this is kind of a long one there, Brandon. I may not have time for it. It's not that bad. All right, Brandon Hill. Good evening, Eric. My grandpa has a 2004 Buick Rendezvous CXL. My French is not so great. A couple of years back, she had the front passenger wheel bearing replaced. The brake would sometimes grab real hard when braking and turning right, and the anti-lock ABS and service traction system light would come on. After that repair, everything functioned as normal. Then a few months later, the rear passenger side wheels started making noise, so my uncle replaced it. I'm guessing wheel bearing, as well as the brakes and rotors. Now, for some reason, it's starting to make that noise in the front wheel bearing again. It only happens when she turns right and brakes. But the traction active light comes on. When turning the traction off, it somewhat makes the problem go away. Thoughts? If I'm not mistaken, the wheel bearings on GMs many times contain the tone ring for the ABS sensor. If they have an issue or they become contaminated with, like, say, debris or perhaps metal from the brakes, maybe some brakes went metal to metal or something like that, and that sensor is in essence a magnet. So it attracts any shavings, if you will, that happen during braking, especially, well, during braking when you have metal-to-metal contact brakes themselves. So that can contaminate a sensor and cause those types of issues. Also, the brakes themselves can make noise. It's really difficult to say. I mean, you didn't really describe what type of noise. I'm assuming it's a wheel bearing type noise, which is sort of a humming low noise that you get. But many times what I find with noises like this, particularly after brake jobs, is it's the brakes or the splash shield. You're not supposed to call it a backing plate because the backing plate is on drum brakes. Splash shields are behind disc brakes. So what I've seen happen, and this has happened to me many times, is you do a brake job and you get everything apart and you put it all back together, but in the process you knocked a bunch of rust or something loose. Or you might have bent that splash shield a little bit during the process of moving stuff around, and as a result, now when you make a turn or something, the pads make a weird contact, or just that splash shield makes contact, or something is making contact with those brakes. What you're describing, however, with this traction light coming on and things like that, I wonder if there is some kind of contamination there that might be involved, or I wonder if those wheel bearings are bad, perhaps for a second time. It's a really tough call, if I'm honest, especially without hearing it for myself and try to get my hands on it. But I'll also throw this into the mix. Many times, wheel bearing noises are actually tire noises. And I encourage you, if you have what you perceive to be a wheel bearing noise, to rotate the tires first before you start diving into a wheel bearing. I would say tires are probably the #1 cause of that type of noise, and it's not necessarily a wheel bearing problem. And you can use my video on checking for wheel bearing problems by jacking up one wheel. If you're not comfortable with that, a lot of people have suggested driving on the road and making sharp turns back and forth. Well, not necessarily on the road, maybe parking lot, something like that, and then listening to see where the noise intensifies. And I believe it's the opposite wheel than the direction that you're turning. So if you're turning right, then it would be the left wheel bearing, and I know it's that way with axles. But if you're turning left, then it would be the right wheel bearing. Don't quote me on that. It's not a method that I employ often. In fact, it's not a method that I usually employ. I usually do what I showed in the video. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, and completely understandable that you wouldn't, then you can use that as an alternative method for checking wheel bearings and those noises. Now, a lot of people think that, you know, when you have a wheel bearing noise, that you can just grab the wheel and move it around and there'll be looseness. In my experience, noisy wheel bearings aren't loose. They're tight. I've actually had wheel bearings that were completely bad, and it was almost like the wheel was going to fall off. It didn't make any noise at all, oddly. However, you know, I've heard, you know, I had wheels that seemed solidly mounted, and those things made all kinds of noise. So as far as noise, as far as wheel bearings being bad and it being revealed by moving the wheel around, you're not always going to see that. So you can have a noisy wheel bearing and the wheel will seem solid on the axle. So don't think that that's a valid diagnosis. I would say try either that steering back and forth method, but start with rotating the tires and rule that out first, because just rotating front to back, the noise moved, you know it's not the wheel bearing, you know it's the tire. So that's where I would look for your problems. And always buy the best tires you can possibly afford. You will always get your money back on that investment in every single way. Oh geez, do I have time for one more? All right. Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I've got one here. Don't know. I don't see. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to do. Yeah, everything seems like it's going to be too long and too protracted for me to get into. So I apologize if I was not able to answer your question today. However, we're going to have our next show on August 27th, same bat time, same bat channel. That would be 7 p.m. Eastern Standard to 7:30. Well, thank you for watching. And once again, if you're posting questions to the YouTube video, I'm not going to be answering those because, as I said during the show, I can't see those kinds of things. Also, after the show is over, I won't be answering those questions either posted to Google Plus or anywhere else. However, you can post to the August 27th show, and I will do my best to get to as many as possible. And always, as I stated, you can go to EricTheCarGuy.com. There's a welcome video there to tell you about all of our amazing features there that are designed to help you with automotive issues, should you have them. So go there, check it out. And if you can't get a direct answer there, post it to the forum. Other than that, you can find me on Google+, Facebook, and Twitter. And I close each of my videos, including these lovely live videos, with be safe, have fun, and stay dirty. Once again, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Take care.